you. So you also were orphaned early, and then you were schooled by your Irish elders in ancient Druidic knowledge and the Brehon Law. Now, before I go on and talk about the first-rate science education you got at UC Cork, and then 2 PhDs in the United States and Canada, tell us what Druidic knowledge is and what's the Brehon Law?
What are the Brehon Laws? Well, the thing is that in Ireland, around the time of Christ and before the time of Christ, Ireland was known as a country of education. The children of kings from all over the Eastern Europe and Spain and France were sent to Ireland as wards. And they would be teenage wards to train them into thinking, philosophy, all kinds of areas of thought that they were put into, and then they were sent back to their families. So my family had been in action since about the 5th century, and the castle that they did all the teaching from was the Castle of Ross in Killarney. And Killarney, when I went to, and I knew that behind that there was a huge amount of learning and all kinds of things as Gaeilge. So I was introduced to that when my parents and everybody died. My mother's family decided that because I wouldn't be getting money because of primogeniture, you heard about that. No, there is no such a thing as a woman being a lord. There's no such a thing as women inheriting titles and so on and so forth. So what they decided to do, 22 women, they were all in their 1880s and 90s. They had Latin and Greek, but they were teaching me Aus Gaeilge in Irish. And so I was brought every day and taught for about 4 years all of the body, mind, and soul. The protection of body, mind, and soul, what you do, meditation, it's a system of telepathy where you do a concentration on somebody and it gives you some protection. I could talk about that. It's very interesting phenomenon. And then medicines, all the medicines of the forest, the medicines of Anfánias. Mary, you would have seen the Fánias in Ireland, the great big huge circles, and they were the old areas of the Druidic culture. But let me explain about Druids for once and for all. An Druid a Breizh in Gaelic means the people who practice magic. And if you did not know about a television or a radio and you went into a farmer's field and put a radio down and started it up and you had voices coming from the radio, you think, oh my God, we're being visited by gods. So the ordinary people who were not that advanced in their education thought the Druids were an Druid a Breizh. And actually their proper names were Aluna. Alune, Aluna. The Aluna is the equivalent of professors. And they took 17 years worth of education to be a doctor, to be a physician, to be a lawyer, to be a songwriter, to be a musician, the whole thing. So it was a very educated kind of culture that Ireland had. And we've all been told that we're idiots. We've all been told that the Irish are no good, but actually did nothing but study. And I was told by my mother's people when they were finished with me, they thought I was educated at the age of 16. They told me I was to go to university and study every single subject that I possibly could. And they told me at the time of now, and this is the time of the big lies. That's what I was told. This is the time of the big lies, that old wisdom, ancient wisdom had to be knitted together with the knowledge we have to make a foundation of certainty and thinking for the population of the world right now. And I didn't believe it. I thought, wow, this is crap. I mean, like every teenager would think that. So I hit the library and the medical library and the library where I used to sit and test out all of the treatments and all of the cures that I was taught. And actually, they're all right. They're all correct.
You mean the ancient wisdom was verified by your scientific training, is what you're saying?
By scientific training.
Diana was orphaned at a young age and raised by her relatives in remote, rural southwestern Ireland, where she received a Druidic education from her Gaelic-speaking relatives. Traditional teachings that go back millennia, predating the arrival of Christianity and English invaders.
So my tutoring involved protection of myself as a woman, was number one, actually. the Celtic triads of body, mind and soul. And it wasn't St. Patrick who had the triad, the shamrock. It was there way, way before him. That was the body, mind and soul, the triad of unity. So I was taught how to look after myself mentally. I got my instruction aus Gaeilge. Yeah, it was aus Gaeilge. Everything was aus Gaeilge. And it was just wonderful. They had books of Latin and Greek and Irish, and the rebellion really was up in Lochavawn. That was my grandfather's place. My grandfather was a Brehon. He was a judge, a judge in the old style, a Brehon judge. Mm-hmm. And up in Lochavawn, the horses couldn't get up there. Nobody could get up there. And they kept the Shancas Moor, which would be equivalent to the Koran or the Bible. Mm. They kept it up there. And my grandfather had the best Irish of anybody around, and the university came around to, take down his Irish. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. But the English did not get up to Lochavawn, and they did not get out to the Blasket Islands. So there was a place where they knew this was happening, where all of this valuable stuff was kept, the valuable old things. Mm-hmm. And as much as they could transfer to me was transferred to me.
Is that if this is sort of the joke in Druidry, is if you ask 5 different Druids about Druidry, you're going to get 10 different answers. And that can be very confusing to new people, because the truth is that there is no one right way to practice Druidry. There is no one right Druidry. I can speak for how AODA and OBOD practice Druidry because I have gone through all of those curriculums. I can speak about my own practices, but I am not an authority, and there's not really a overall authority that says this is who gets to call themselves Druids. And so I really want to really stress that to you. Each Druid's path is unique, and we really value each individual's path and the right of each individual to sort of find their own path within the tradition. So that particular piece, I say that to begin so that you understand that this is, I'm not saying this is this, and I tried in this presentation to represent the different paths of Druidry as well, and you'll see that. But I am not the authority on Druidry. There is no authority on Druidry, and I would say if somebody said that they were the ultimate authority on Druidry, we would probably just ignore them because that's just not the way it is. So, with that said, what is Druidry? Druidry is a nature-based spiritual path that at its core is about you connecting with nature. That would be the nature outside of your door. You're in a city, you're connecting with the trees on your street. You're in the country, you're connecting with your local forest. And as Druids, I think the ultimate thing that we all agree on is that we find spiritual connection in nature. We see nature as good. We see nature as sacred. We do have a tradition, and I'll talk about where the term Druid comes from. And we recognize that we do have this spiritual connection to the ancient Druids. We recognize that as spiritual ancestors. Some of us may actually have ancestry that links back to the British Isles or Gaul or, what is now modern France, and some people don't, and we don't really care about that. Druidry might be its own path, and it also might be tied to other paths or combined with other paths. So somebody like me, I'm pretty much just a Druid, but you might meet Christian Druids, you might meet atheist Druids, you might meet all sorts of Druids. And so some people combine it with other things. And Druidry can be seen as a religion, as a spiritual path, as a life philosophy or life path. So different Druids kind of see it in different ways, and that's cool. One of the things you're going to hear over and over again is that we're pretty flexible, and we want people to have the ability to learn and grow in ways that they see fit. So where did this tradition come from? The modern Druid tradition is inspired by the ancient Druids, and the ancient Druids were found throughout the British Isles and Western Europe. And I have the areas listed here: Ireland, Scotland, Great Britain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, parts of Switzerland, Netherlands, Germany, and Northern Italy. And that sort of depends on historically when you're looking. And these ancient wise sages kept history, traditions, and they essentially guided the spiritual life of their people. And they had three branches, the Vates, the Bards, and the Druids. And so one of the things that we have to recognize is the ancient Druid tradition no longer exists. It was fully eradicated by the Romans, and in 42 BCE to 37 CE. So a lot of what we know about the ancient Druids today comes through either mythology, surviving legends, the writings of Roman authors, which is about 9 pages in total, and it also comes from things like archaeology. But really, in the end, we are talking about a broken lineage tradition, and we're not talking about a tradition that has a ton of ancient content. And I think that's important to recognize. So what happened is that after this happened, then there was this thing called the Druid revival. So in the 1700s and 1800s, we saw these huge changes upon the landscape. There were, industrialization was happening. Cities, were building up. People were going into factories. The land was really being extracted. And so the Druid revival at this point was born out of this sort of need of people in the 1700s and 1800s need to recognize, hey, we want to go back to the land. We want to honor these ancients. And so there's a lot of rich history here. And one thing I'll say is that the Druid revivalists, the early ones, were very creative and they were inventive, and they were not always accurate. They made up what they didn't have. So our tradition has kind of gone through a lot of different changes since that time. But ultimately, I think something that is sort of key about everything that came after this period is that modern Druidry has continued to respond to sort of industrialization and sort of humans' relationship with the land. And that's really where our core. Today, we essentially have two major divisions in the Druid tradition. We have the modern Druid revival that sort of continues those practices from the 1700s and 1800s. And this tradition is, I think, more flexible. And it's really, I think the root of the tradition now is focused on creating a 21st century Druidry that responds to the challenges of the age. We're pretty I say we because I fit in this category. We're pretty non-dogmatic, open to diverse practices and beliefs, and there's a lot of blending. The other group of Druids are mostly some form of Celtic reconstructivists. This is a movement that started in the 1970s, and really these folks are trying to reconstruct ancient Druids' beliefs and practices, which means that they are primarily polytheistic. There's a lot of focus on ancestor and deity worship. They might use the term Druidism more often than Druidry, and there's a lot of emphasis on like archaeology and history and mythology. So these are some of the, I would say here are probably the top big, at least many of the big orders, Druid orders in the world fit into one of these two categories. I think that in times past, there used to be a lot of tension between these groups, but I've found that in the last maybe like 8 or 10 years, that's just not the case as much as it used to be. There's a lot of value in both. A lot of people, even if you're in the Druid revival, you want to know about the ancient Druids, you draw upon that history. If you're working in Celtic reconstructivism, you still might be really interested in some revival practices. So both of these practices have their strengths and value, and you do not have to pick one. But I think when you're getting into the tradition, it's important to recognize that these two sort of divisions exist. Because that sort of determines a lot of how Druidry is taught and talked about. And of course, it's rooted in history. So what do Druids actually believe? This is actually kind of hard because, again, if you ask 5 different Druids what they believe, you're going to get 10 different answers. But here are things that I would say most Druids would agree that they believe. The first and most important is that nature is good. We recognize that nature is sacred. Nature should be revered and honored and protected, and that we can find our connection and spiritual connection in nature. Nature is a place of healing. Nature is our sacred text. Nature is our church. And I think that almost all Druids would recognize that there is a physical and metaphysical world, and there is some kind of spirit in nature, whether or not you interpret that as God in nature or deities or nature spirits. Like there's a lot of diversity when we get to that third bullet point, but nature as a whole is good. Generally, I think that the majority of Druids lean towards being animist, polytheist, or neo-pagan or something like that. But we have very large groups of Druids that are, we have a large contingent of Christian Druids that are combining Christianity with Druidry. We have lots of folks that are doing other kinds of combinations. You find the combining more in the Druid revival because the Druid revival is a bit more flexible, but that can happen in multiple ways. Beyond that, Druids don't necessarily have a standard belief. Like there's not a God we all believe in, because some Druids might be Christian and have a really different understanding of the world than, say, somebody like me who's an animist. So just to give you an example, when we think about beliefs, we don't really, like in AODA, we don't actually specify beliefs. This is an example of our core practices and values. So this is a way that we frame this. So rather than beliefs, we actually think about what do we do, because beliefs are specific to the person, but these tools on this slide describe some of what we do. So this is just an example of how we manifest, like who are we and what we do. And so these are the things that we value in AODA. And you can see there in the very center, personal, spiritual development and expression is sort of our root. So, okay, so you kind of already heard a little bit about this, but can I combine Druidry with other traditions? Yes. Druidry is a very flexible tradition. And so many people choose to take up that path while still practicing or holding on to other traditions. And the nice thing about Druidry is that you can sort of practice as much of it as you want. And many people will use that as a nature connection that might be missing from a traditional other practice that they have. And AODA in particular does this particularly well because our curriculum is self-designed, but many other Druids do as well. Some people don't really feel that they need another tradition. Some people are like, no, Druidry is enough, while other people are like, no, like I still have this set of other beliefs. The good news is that we're cool either way. So you can combine or not, and you can change your mind over time, or there's a lot of room in the tradition for you to explore different sets of beliefs and then continue to evolve. And that's not going to sort of, wreck your understanding of Druidry. You can have as many crises of faith or shifts in your beliefs as you want, because belief is not something that is very personal to us. All right, so now that you kind of have a sense of the history and what we believe, and a little bit about who we are, I'm going to now go into what I think is some of the coolest parts of the tradition, our basic paths. So if you go back to that history slide, you'll remember that the ancient Druids had the Vates, the Druids, and the Bards. And we have taken those ancient divisions, which are different than they are now. They're different then than they are now. And we have three core paths, and on this graphic, you can see some of those. So we have the path of the ovate. Different orders interpret this in slightly different ways, but it always ties to nature in some ways. So how do you learn about nature? How do you learn to be a good human on your landscape, working with nature, learning about nature in various ways, giving back to nature? We get into this idea in AODA of wildcrafting, which essentially means that I am going to build a personal spiritual practice connected to the earth that is specific to my local ecosystem. So for me, I work with mountains that are in my region. I work very closely with the sacred trees. And whenever I do my daily ritual, I call to the sacred trees that are present on my landscape, as an example. So I learned about those trees through the path of the ovate. The path of the Druid is what most people would consider like typical, like spiritual practice. We have everything from meditation and ritual to divination, lore, history. People pick up things like astrology, all sorts of things go under the path of the Druid. And then the final one is the path of the Bard. And I think this is one of the things that make us really unique. This is personal and community-based spiritual expression and creative expression. So creativity is sacred in our tradition, and we honor that, and I'll give a little bit more about that. So these three paths make up a lot of the ways in which people express themselves as Druids. And what's important here is that different Druid orders, if you wanted to join a Druid order and learn, Different Druid orders have different approaches to how they actually teach these. Some Druid orders have you work on a path. One, you do a bard path, then you do an ovate path, then you do a druid path, and that's the OBOD. That's the order of bards, ovates, and druids. In AODA, you choose a path each time. So maybe you're always practicing ovate arts, or you're always practicing druid arts, or you want to practice multiple arts. So that kind of gives you a sense. So to get more into these three paths, our ovate practices are all about sort of nature and nature connection. So this can really be anything from like, oh, okay, I don't really know a lot about my ecosystem, so I'm going to learn. I'm going to study ecology, or I'm going to look at what are the edible plants in my ecosystem, or how could I make medicine? How can I learn foraging, ancestral skills? Anyone that's ever gone to like an earth skills gathering, that would all be ovate for us. But also, hey, maybe I want to convert my lawn and, start growing my own food. So things like permaculture and organic gardening, all that fits there. Or you're really into rewilding. You're like, hey, nature just needs to grow and I want to scatter seeds. I want to regenerate. Land healing, I do a lot of that stuff. Also, in many sort of Druid orders, we would consider working with the spirits of nature through sort of spirit communication or animism, magical herbalism as part of ovate. So I'm going to work with catnip. Catnip is going to heal my stomach, and I'm going to connect with the spirit of catnip. So these are all sorts of things. And for those of us who do this long enough, suddenly we know more about the living earth than anybody else. And so maybe we start teaching it and offering plant walks or conservation support and those sorts of things. What happens often is if you've been in this tradition a while, at some point it becomes not just personal, but you want to start helping nature more. And so some of us end up in that kind of place. Druid practices. So these are all the practices that are tied to the metaphysical and are focused on sort of bridging the inner world of our spirits and the outer world of, the world, right? So this would be like, I want to write a healing ritual for my local landscape and maybe have 10 of my friends come and join me. I want to learn how to, read a tarot deck or divination. I want to learn how to do spirit journeying or astral travel, or I want to deepen my meditation. All of the various occult disciplines fit in here. Creating magical tools, but also like self-work and shadow work. And sometimes this also fits in things like, how do I help others along this path? How do I become a good teacher? And again, for people that have been on this path a while, that can happen. So the bardic practices. Bardic practices, and this picture actually is from an early Druid gathering, one of the East Coast gatherings, and that's Dave the Bard. For those of you who might be ever have heard his music, it's spelled D-A-M-H, but it's Dave the Bard, and he's playing a song, and there's a bunch of Druids around a fire. And this is a perfect example of the bardic arts. So we are enjoying singing and poetry and tales and stories all around the fire. So this is one of the things we do. It's called the Eisteddfod, and we join together as a community around a fire, or in someone's living room, and we share our creative practices. So that is any kind of creative practice fits in here. Writing and visual arts. You're actually seeing my bardic arts in this when you're seeing my paintings. And a lot of this also has to do with the concept of Awen. So you have actually seen an Awen symbol several times. I'll point it out to you next time. And this is channeling the Awen. So the Awen is nature inspired or divine inspiration, where you have an idea, suddenly you have this spark. That's the spark of Awen. Or you get really, really deep into whatever it is you're doing. You're writing something or you're painting something, and suddenly like you lose yourself in it. That is the flow of Awen. So that is the bardic practice. And what's cool about the Druid tradition is that we see creativity as a sacred practice. And many of us practice that as part of our spiritual practice, which is, I think, very unique and not something that many traditions have. Okay, so all right, this sounds cool, Dana. I'm in. How do I start? All right. So this is actually probably the most common question we get. We get it on our Facebook page. We get it in our forums. constantly, probably once a week, somebody writes to me through my blog and is like, how do I get started? And there's lots of ways to get started. There's not really a wrong way to get started. I would say the best way to get started is like get outside as much as you can. If you want to practice nature spirituality, getting outside and learning directly from nature is the way to go. The more that you spend time in nature, the better that these practices work. Other things that you can do is to establish a regular spiritual practice. This is where our Druid orders come in, because we can give you a framework and teach you how to do these things. So this typically would look like having some kind of regular meditative practice where you are able to quiet your mind or focus your mind in a way that you can start having sort of a different experience that is not so screen driven, right? Doing some kind of daily protective work, regular time in nature, exploring your own creative practices, taking time to do so, and documenting. So those are just some really basic things. All of these things we teach in AODA, we teach them in OBOD, we teach them all over the place. Earth honoring living, as you start to connect with nature more and more deeply, you can recognize that the lifestyles that we have in typical Western culture are pretty terrible for the earth. And I don't think anybody would really disagree with that in 2024. So as we get to that point, we really work to avoid what we call the Druid's paradox, where you're living, you want to see nature as sacred, but you're living a lifestyle that is maybe not honoring nature. And so we work to sort of, how do we do better? How do we live a more earth honoring lifestyle? And finally, connecting with others. So, all right, this sounds cool. How do I actually start practicing as a Druid? The modern Druid tradition, some orders recognize the Eightfold Wheel of the Year. That the Eightfold Wheel of the Year was actually developed by Ross Nichols and Gerald Gardner. Ross Nichols went off to form the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and Gerald Gardner went off to form the modern Wicca tradition. And so Wicca and Druidry share the Eightfold Wheel of the Year. So a lot of Druids celebrate that. Some find it doesn't really fit their ecosystem, so then they start adapting. Other Druids may only celebrate the solstices and equinoxes. So I actually sort of have a little graphic here that show the solstices and equinoxes, the directions, the moons. And so, you can sort of layer lots of patterns. So that is, so most Druids are doing at least solstices and equinoxes and maybe the cross quarter days, which would be the Eightfold Wheel of the Year. Other folks, now remember, if you're blending traditions, you might have a whole other set of holidays because you're also practicing Buddhism or whatever, right? And Druids also may develop other holidays as per or observances. So for me, first snowfall is really important. First hard frost. So the day that the maple trees run for the first time. So you may also develop sort of celebrations that are tied to your ecosystem. So you don't have to follow this wheel, but solstices and equinoxes are nice because that's the wheel of the sun. So everybody experiences that. And that can be pretty easy to sort of grab onto. You also can create your own wheels. So this is a wheel that I developed to help me deal with the fact that the Anthropocene is happening and some of the traditional things that used to happen at certain points in the year are no longer happening. So I developed this as sort of a meditative exercise to really think about how do I adapt to this age. So this is just another example. This is me wildcrafting my Druidry.